She thought her past was behind her until her abusive ex showed up at her door. But just when she thought she had nowhere left to turn, a tough, silent war vet steps in. And the shocking truth about his past changes everything. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed out the cream-colored stationery on her worn oak kitchen table. Morning sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow on the collection of photos arranged beside her writing materials. Her late husband Thomas smiled at her from a silver frame, the photo taken during happier times, before illness had taken him from her. She picked up her favorite blue pen, the one that always seemed to help the words flow more easily. The blank page stared back at her, full of possibility. Grace had been writing letters to deployed soldiers for nearly 2 years now, ever since her neighbor Janet had mentioned the program at their weekly garden club meeting. "Dear Private Michael," she began, her neat handwriting flowing across the page. "I hope this letter finds you well. Here in Minnesota, spring is finally showing its face. The daffodils I told you about in my last letter have bloomed, painting my garden in cheerful yellows and whites." She paused, glancing at her garden through the kitchen window. A robin hopped between the flower beds, searching for its morning meal. The sight brought a gentle smile to her face. "Sometimes," she continued writing, "the simplest things can bring the greatest joy. This morning I watched a robin building its nest in the maple tree outside my window. It reminded me of what you wrote about the sparrows that visit your base camp. Even in the midst of difficult circumstances, life finds a way to bring beauty into our days." Grace reached for her cup of tea, taking a small sip of the now lukewarm liquid. Her eyes drifted to another photograph, this one of her husband in his own military uniform, taken decades ago during his service in Vietnam. Thomas had always said that letters from home were like lifelines, connecting soldiers to the world they'd left behind. "I want you to know, Michael, that your last letter about missing your sister's wedding touched my heart deeply. While we can't change these circumstances, please remember that your sacrifice means something. You're not just missing these moments, you're protecting them, ensuring that others can celebrate their special days in peace and safety." Her pen moved steadily across the page as she shared stories about her week. The book club meeting, where they discussed a novel about courage and friendship, the community garden project she'd joined, and the funny incident with Mrs. Peterson's escaped cat that had the whole neighborhood searching for hours. "It might seem ordinary," she wrote, "but I believe it's these everyday moments that remind us what we're all fighting for. A community coming together to find a lost pet, neighbors sharing coffee and conversation over garden fences, children playing safely in their front yards. These are the precious pieces of life that your service helps protect." Grace paused again, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Writing these letters often stirred up emotions she thought she'd tucked away. The quiet of her kitchen seemed to amplify the sound of her pen scratching against paper as she continued. "I've enclosed a packet of wildflower seeds in this letter. They're from my own garden, the same ones that attract the butterflies I've told you about. I know you mentioned the barrenness of your surroundings, and while you might not be able to plant them now, I hope they serve as a reminder that beauty and growth await your return home." Her fingers brushed against the small paper packet of seeds she'd prepared the day before. It was a small gesture, but she hoped it would bring a smile to the young soldier's face, just as his letters brought light to her quiet days. "You asked in your last letter how I stay positive despite life's challenges. The truth is, reaching out to others, like writing these letters to you, helps me as much as I hope it helps you. After losing Thomas, I felt adrift in a world that seemed too big and too empty. But connecting with others, sharing our stories and hopes, reminds me that we're all part of something larger than ourselves." Grace looked up at Thomas's photo again, remembering how he used to sit at this very table, writing letters to their children when they first left for college. He had taught her the value of written words, how they could bridge distances and heal hearts. "Every letter I write is a reminder that while we may feel alone sometimes, we're all connected by the threads of our shared humanity. Your courage, your dedication, and your willingness to serve inspire me to be braver in my own life." As she neared the end of her letter, Grace carefully folded the small packet of seeds into the pages, I look forward to hearing from you when you can write. Until then, know that you're in my thoughts and prayers. May these seeds remind you that hope blooms in the most unexpected places." She signed her name with a flourish, adding a small heart beside it, something she'd started doing in all her letters, a tiny symbol of the care and attention she poured into each one. With practiced movements, she folded the letter and slid it into an envelope, making sure the seed packet was secure. After writing the address and affixing a stamp, she held the envelope for a moment, saying a silent prayer for the young soldier who would receive it. Rising from her chair, Grace walked to the window, letter in hand. The morning sun had risen higher now, casting longer shadows across her garden. She watched as the robin returned to its nest, carrying a small twig in its beak. The sight stirred something in her heart, a reminder that life was a continuous cycle of building, nurturing, and growing. These letters had become more than just a way to support deployed soldiers. They were her connection to the world beyond her quiet home, a purpose that filled the void left by Thomas's passing. Each envelope carried not just words and seeds, but pieces of her heart, hope, and healing. Looking down at the sealed envelope in her hands, Grace felt a familiar warmth spread through her chest. In reaching out to others, she had found her own path forward, one letter at a time. The simple act of sharing her thoughts, her garden, and her life with someone far away had become the solace she never expected to find. Ben wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of grease across his weathered skin. The familiar scent of motor oil and metal filled the air of his small mechanic shop. His calloused hands worked steadily on the old Ford truck's engine, the methodical work providing the kind of peace he'd learned to appreciate over the years. The radio played softly in the background, mostly static, with fragments of country music breaking through. Ben didn't mind the interference. The white noise helped drown out the thoughts that sometimes crept in when things got too quiet. "Almost got you fixed up," he muttered to the truck, tightening a bolt with practiced precision. Working with engines made sense to him. They were logical, predictable. Unlike people, machines told you exactly what was wrong if you knew how to listen. The phone in his pocket buzzed. Ben stepped back from the engine and pulled it out, a rare smile crossing his face when he saw Sophia's name on the screen. He wiped his hands on the red shop rag tucked into his belt before answering. "Hey, kiddo." "Dad. How's work going?" Sophia's cheerful voice filled the shop. "Same as always. Just fixing Mrs. Henderson's truck. How are your classes?" "They're good. Psychology is kicking my butt, but I'm managing." There was a pause. "Have you been sleeping okay?" Ben's jaw tightened slightly. His daughter knew him too well. "I'm fine, Sophia. Don't worry about your old man." "Dad, you know I'm going to worry anyway. That's kind of my thing." Her tone was light, but he could hear the concern underneath. "Just focus on your studies. I've got everything under control here." Ben walked over to his workbench, absently organizing his tools as they talked. "Are you sure? Because I can come home this weekend if—" "No," he said, perhaps too quickly. "No, honey, you stay there. Enjoy college life." "I'm okay, really." The silence on the other end told him Sophia wasn't convinced, but she didn't push it. "Okay, Dad. But promise you'll call if you need anything?" "Promise." Ben's eyes drifted to the small photo of Sophia at her high school graduation that he kept on his workbench. "Love you, kiddo." "Love you too, Dad. Don't work too late." After hanging up, Ben stood there for a moment, the quiet of the shop settling around him again. He glanced at his watch. 5:30 p.m. Usually he'd stay later, lose himself in the work until exhaustion made sleep possible. But something about Sophia's call made him want to call it a day. He cleaned up his tools with military precision, each one returning to its designated spot. The habit was one of many he'd brought back from his service days. Some habits were useful. Others, well, those were the ones that kept him up at night. The sun was setting as Ben locked up the shop, casting long shadows across the gravel parking lot. His old blue pickup truck sat waiting, reliable as ever. The drive home was short, just 15 minutes through their small town, but it gave him time to decompress. He passed the diner where he and Sophia used to have their Sunday breakfasts, the park where he'd taught her to ride a bike, the high school where she'd given her valedictorian speech just months ago. Every landmark held memories, making her absence feel more pronounced. His house sat at the end of a quiet street, a modest two-story with white siding and dark green shutters. The porch light was off. He kept forgetting to leave it on now that Sophia wasn't there to remind him. The sight of the dark house stirred something in his chest, a feeling he tried to ignore. Inside, the silence was different from the peaceful quiet of his shop. This silence felt heavy, empty. Ben's footsteps echoed as he made his way to the kitchen, dropping his keys in the wooden bowl by the door. Another habit, everything in its place. He grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and headed to the front porch, his favorite spot for evening reflection. The wooden chair creaked as he sat down, the familiar sound almost welcoming. From here, he could see the whole street, watch the neighbors walking their dogs, children riding their bikes home before dinner. His eyes drifted to the shelf just inside the front window, visible through the screen door. There, carefully preserved in a shoebox, were the letters. He'd kept every single one from his deployment days. Messages from fellow soldiers, updates from home, words of encouragement from strangers who supported the troops. Those letters had been lifelines during the darkest days of his service, reminders that there was a world beyond the chaos and violence. Now, they served as silent testimonies to a time he rarely discussed, even with Sophia. The evening air grew cooler as Ben sat there, watching the last rays of sunlight fade from the sky. The empty house behind him seemed to grow larger in the growing darkness, its silence more pronounced. Sophia's absence felt particularly heavy tonight. Her empty room upstairs, a reminder of how quickly time had passed. He took another sip of water, his thoughts drifting back to the letters on the shelf. Maybe it was time to read through them again. Sometimes, when the memories became too sharp, the words from those pages helped dull their edges. They reminded him that even in the honors, the loneliest moments, connections existed. Invisible threads linking people across distance and time. The street lamps flickered on, casting pools of yellow light along the sidewalk. Ben remained on the porch, the weight of solitude settling around him like an old familiar blanket. The house stood quiet behind him, waiting, while the letters sat on their shelf, holding stories he wasn't quite ready to share. Grace smoothed her lavender cardigan and checked her watch walking down Main Street. The autumn breeze carried fallen leaves and wood smoke, sunshine warming her face. She'd anticipated lunch at Annie's Diner all morning. Their chicken pot pie was perfect for today. Familiar storefronts reflected midday sun. Thompson's Hardware, Mary's Flowers, the old bookshop. She'd walked this route hundreds of times, but today felt different. Hair stood up on her neck, unease settling in her stomach. That's when she saw him. Tom stood near the diner, his tall frame casting shadows. Grace recognized his shoulders, how he planted his feet like he owned the ground. Her steps faltered, heart racing. "This can't be happening," she whispered, hands trembling as she clutched her purse. Tom hadn't been in town since the divorce. She'd finally felt safe again, building life without looking over her shoulder. His head turned. Their eyes met. The same cold stare she remembered. His mouth curved into what others might mistake for a smile, but Grace knew better. "Well, if it isn't my dear wife." Tom's voice cut through her thoughts. He stepped forward, blocking her path. "Ex-wife," Grace corrected, hating how small her voice sounded. She kept distance, aware of other pedestrians. Public spaces were safer. "Why don't you join me for lunch? We can catch up," he said. It wasn't a request. Grace recognized the command, the threat. Refusing would make things worse. "Fine, just lunch," she said, walking past him. The diner's bell chimed. Sally waved cheerfully before her expression faltered seeing Tom. They settled into a booth. Grace chose the side facing the door. Tom's presence overwhelmed the small space. "Coffee?" Sally asked. "Yes, and water," Grace said, throat dry. "Black coffee," Tom said without looking at Sally. After Sally left, Tom leaned forward. "You're looking well, Grace. What do you want, Tom? After everything we shared? Everything I did for you?" His voice dropped dangerously. "Everything you did to me," Grace replied. Tom's hand slammed the table, silverware rattling. "You always were ungrateful. I gave you everything. How did you repay me? Running away, turning our children against me. The children made their own choices after seeing how you treated us." Tom's expression shifted, becoming gentle. "I've changed, Grace. I want to make things right." "No. You won't give me a chance? I gave you chances for 20 years. "I'm not doing it again." His face darkened. "You think you're independent now? Living alone? Writing pathetic letters? You're nothing without me. Sooner or later you'll remember that." Grace stood, legs trembling. "Goodbye, Tom." She walked to the counter, handed Sally a 20. "For the coffee." Outside, she heard Tom's footsteps following. "This isn't over, Grace. You can't avoid me forever. We both know you're not strong enough." Grace kept walking, one foot in front of the other, fear clawing her throat. Her house seemed miles away. Tom's words echoed, mixing with memories she'd tried forgetting. Tears threatened, but she blinked them back. She couldn't show weakness, not with Tom watching. The streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk as Grace hurried home. Her sensible shoes clicked against the concrete, each step echoing in the quiet evening air. The confrontation at the diner had left her stomach in knots, and she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She clutched her purse closer to her body and picked up her pace. The familiar storefronts that had seemed so welcoming earlier now loomed dark and unfriendly. A car drove past, its headlights momentarily illuminating the street, and Grace's heart skipped a beat. The sound of footsteps behind her made her pulse quicken. She didn't need to look back. She knew those heavy, deliberate steps. Tom was following her. The realization made her hands tremble, but she kept walking, her mind racing through possible escape routes. "Hey, Grace!" Tom's voice carried down the street. "Don't pretend you can't hear me." Grace's throat tightened. She walked faster, her legs shaking with each step. The distance between her house and where she stood suddenly seemed impossibly long. "I'm talking to you." Tom's voice grew closer, anger edging into his words. "You always did think you were too good for me, didn't you?" The rumble of an approaching truck caught Grace's attention. Through the gathering darkness, she recognized the familiar red pickup, its paint slightly faded, a small dent in the passenger door. The truck slowed as it approached, and Grace's heart leaped when she saw Ben behind the wheel, his expression changing from casual observation to concerned recognition. The truck came to a stop, and Ben stepped out, his movements measured but purposeful. He stood tall, his presence commanding attention even in the dim light. His eyes moved from Grace to Tom, taking in the situation with the quick assessment of someone used to reading threats. "Everything okay here?" Ben's voice was calm but firm, carrying the weight of authority. Tom's footsteps faltered. "This is none of your business, friend." "Grace?" Ben turned his attention to her, his expression softening. "You all right?" Grace's voice trembled slightly as she spoke. I was just heading home." Ben nodded, positioning himself between Grace and Tom. "I can see that." He turned back to Tom, his stance protective, but not aggressive. "I think the lady wants to be left alone." Tom's face twisted into an ugly sneer. "Look, buddy, you don't know anything about this situation. Grace and I have history." "History's just that. History," Ben replied, his voice level but carrying an edge of steel. "And from what I can see, she's not interested in reviewing it with you right now." Grace watched the exchange, her heart pounding. Ben's presence made her feel safer, but she also felt exposed, vulnerable, her private struggles now on display in the middle of the street. Tom took a step forward, his fists clenched. "Who do you think you are? Someone who doesn't like seeing people harassed on the street." Ben didn't move, didn't raise his voice, but something in his bearing, perhaps the way he stood, or the quiet confidence in his words, made Tom hesitate. The tension crackled in the air between them. Grace could see Tom's internal struggle playing across his face. The desire to assert dominance warring with the recognition that he'd lost the upper hand. Finally, Tom took a step back. "This isn't over, Grace," he spat, his voice thick with malice. "You can't hide behind strangers forever." Ben remained still until Tom turned and walked away, his angry footsteps fading into the night. Only then did he turn to Grace, his expression concerned. "Let me drive you home," he offered quietly. "It's getting dark." Grace hesitated, wrapping her arms around herself. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her feeling shaky and exposed. Part of her wanted to decline, to prove she could handle this on her own. But another part, the part that was still trembling from Tom's presence, recognized the wisdom in accepting help. Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's very kind of you." Ben opened the passenger door of his truck, waiting patiently as Grace gathered herself. The familiar smell of leather and motor oil greeted her as she climbed in, bringing with it an unexpected sense of security. As Ben walked around to the driver's side, Grace caught her reflection in the side mirror. Her face was pale, and her hands were still shaking slightly as they rested in her lap. She felt a complex mix of emotions: gratitude for Ben's intervention, shame at needing help, and a lingering fear of what Tom's threat might mean for her future. Ben slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, its steady rumble filling the uncomfortable silence. He didn't press her to talk, didn't ask for explanations, and somehow that made it easier for Grace to find her voice. "I live just a few blocks down," she said softly. "The blue house with the white trim." Ben nodded, putting the truck in gear. "I know the one. Nice garden out front." The simple observation, the recognition of something she took pride in, brought unexpected tears to Grace's eyes. She blinked them back, staring out the window at the familiar streets passing by. The truck moved slowly through the evening darkness, its headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. Grace could feel Ben's occasional glance in her direction, but he maintained a respectful silence that she found oddly comforting. The short drive gave her time to compose herself, to push back against the vulnerability that threatened to overwhelm her. The blue house came into view, its familiar outline a welcome sight. Ben pulled up to the curb, keeping the engine running. The porch light she'd left on earlier cast a warm glow across the front steps, making the house look like a sanctuary in the growing darkness. The rumble of Ben's truck engine filled the evening air as they drove through the quiet streets. Grace sat with her hands folded in her lap, her fingers absently tracing the worn edges of her purse. The leather seat beneath her was cracked but comfortable, just like the silence that had settled between them. Ben kept his eyes on the road, his strong hands steady on the steering wheel. The dashboard lights cast a soft glow on his face, highlighting the determined set of his jaw and the gentle concern in his eyes. Grace found herself stealing glances at him, noticing how his presence seemed to fill the truck's cabin with a sense of security she hadn't felt in years. "Thank you," Grace said softly, breaking the silence, "for what you did back there." Ben nodded, his expression thoughtful. "No need to thank me. Some men," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "some men don't understand when to leave well enough alone." Grace turned to look out the window, watching the familiar houses pass by. "Tom was always like that, even when we were married. He thinks he owns everything he touches." Her voice trembled slightly, and she pressed her lips together. Ben's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "You don't owe me any explanations, Grace. But if he bothers you again." He left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. The truck hit a small bump, and Grace's shoulder brushed against Ben's arm. She quickly shifted away, but the brief contact sent a flutter through her chest that both surprised and unsettled her. "Turn left at the next corner," she directed, her voice steadier now. The blue house with the white trim. Ben slowed the truck, following her directions. The streetlights cast alternating patterns of light and shadow across the dashboard. Grace found herself studying his profile, the way his expression remained alert, protective, yet gentle. "I've seen you at the diner before," Ben said, his voice low and reassuring. "You're always writing those letters." Grace felt a small smile touch her lips. "Yes, to the soldiers overseas. After my husband passed, it became my way of, she searched for the right words, of staying connected, I suppose, of doing something meaningful. Ben's expression softened. I received letters like that when I was deployed. They meant more than the writers probably ever knew. Grace turned to look at him fully now, seeing him in a new light. You served? 2 tours, he replied simply. But Grace could hear the weight of unspoken memories in those 2 words. They pulled up in front of Grace's house. The porch light she'd left on cast a welcoming glow, but the shadows around the edges of her yard seemed darker than usual. Ben put the truck in park, but left the engine running. Would you like me to check around the house? He offered, his eyes scanning the property with practiced attention. Grace hesitated. Her independent nature wanted to refuse, to prove she could handle things on her own. But Tom's threatening words from earlier echoed in her mind, and she found herself nodding. Ben stepped out of the truck first, his movements purposeful but unhurried. He walked around to open her door, offering his hand to help her down. Grace accepted it after a moment's pause, surprised by how natural it felt to place her small hand in his larger one. They walked up the path to her front door together, Ben slightly ahead, his posture protective but not overwhelming. He checked the porch thoroughly, then waited as Grace unlocked her door. The familiar creak of the hinges seemed louder than usual in the evening quiet. Would you mind? Ben gestured inside, and Grace stepped back to let him enter first. She watched as he moved through her house with quiet efficiency, checking windows and dark corners, his military training evident in every movement. When he returned to the front door, his presence seemed to fill the small entryway. Everything's secure, he said, his voice gentle. But I'd feel better if you double-checked all the locks tonight. Grace nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. I will. She paused, then added, I don't usually. I'm not used to accepting help from others. Ben's eyes met hers, understanding clear in his gaze. Sometimes we all need a little backup. There's no shame in that. For the first time that evening, Grace felt her shoulders truly relax. The fear that had gripped her since seeing Tom wasn't gone, but it had loosened its hold. Ben's steady presence had somehow made her world feel a little more secure, even though every instinct trained by years of caution told her to keep her walls up. Thank you again, she said, meaning it more than she could express. Ben stepped back onto the porch, his silhouette strong against the evening sky. Lock up behind me. And Grace? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. My number's on there, day or night if you need anything. Grace took the card, her fingers brushing against his. I appreciate that. She meant it, even though she wasn't sure if she'd ever use it. Ben nodded once more, then turned and walked back to his truck. Grace stood in the doorway, watching as he climbed in and started the engine. He waited until she closed the door before pulling away, the sound of his truck fading into the night. Inside, Grace leaned against the door, Ben's business card still in her hand. The house felt different somehow. Not as lonely, not as vulnerable. She looked at the card, running her thumb over the embossed letters of his auto repair shop's name. Despite years of building walls around her heart, despite the fear Tom had stirred up, she felt something she hadn't expected. A small spark of safety, of trust, trying to take root. She placed the card carefully on her entry table, next to her letter-writing supplies. The familiar sight of her stationery brought a gentle smile to her face. Tomorrow she would write more letters to soldiers far from home, but tonight she had experienced firsthand what it meant to have someone stand guard over your well-being. The morning sun did little to ease Grace's nerves as she tried to go about her daily routine. Her hands trembled slightly as she watered her window box flowers, remembering yesterday's confrontation. The red geraniums seemed less bright today, their cheerful color unable to lift her spirits. Inside her house, Grace settled at her writing desk, hoping to lose herself in composing letters to soldiers. But the words wouldn't come. Her pen hovered over the cream-colored stationery, leaving only a small ink blot where it touched the paper. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Tom's threatening presence and Ben's unexpected rescue. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Grace forced herself to eat a light dinner, though her appetite had vanished. She washed her dishes methodically, finding some comfort in the familiar routine. The kitchen clock ticked steadily, marking time as darkness crept in through the windows. It was nearly 9 o'clock when the first knock came. Grace froze, her hand clutching the dish towel. Another knock, harder this time, followed by Tom's voice. "Grace, open up! We need to talk!" The words slurred together slightly, making her stomach clench with fear. She backed away from the door, her heart pounding. "Go away, Tom. There's nothing to talk about. Don't be stupid." Tom's voice grew louder. "You can't hide from me forever. Open this door." The handle rattled violently as Tom tried to force his way in. Grace's hands shook as she fumbled for her phone, grateful she'd saved Ben's number yesterday. She pressed the call button, praying he would answer. "Hello?" Ben's deep voice came through after 2 rings. "Ben?" Grace whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm sorry to bother you, but Tom's here. He won't leave, and a loud thud against the door made her jump. "Grace, open this door right now," Tom shouted, his fist pounding against the wood. "I'm on my way," Ben said firmly. "Just stay inside and keep the doors locked. I'll be there in 5 minutes." Grace paced in her living room, jumping at every bang and shout from outside. Tom's threats grew more menacing with each passing minute. She could smell alcohol on his breath even through the door. "You think that mechanic can protect you?" Tom sneered. "He doesn't know you like I do. He doesn't know what you're really like." Grace wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop, shaking. The old grandfather clock in the corner seemed to tick in time with her racing heart. Each second felt like an eternity as she waited for Ben to arrive. The sound of tires on gravel announced Ben's arrival. Through the window, Grace saw his truck pull up, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Ben stepped out, his tall frame moving purposefully toward the house. "Step away from the door, Tom." Ben's voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable note of authority. "This is none of your business," Tom spat, turning to face Ben. "This is between me and my wife." "Ex-wife," Ben corrected. "And you're making it my business by harassing her." Tom took a stumbling step toward Ben. "You think you're some kind of hero, swooping in to save the day?" He laughed bitterly. "You don't know her. You don't know anything." "I know enough," Ben said, moving closer. "I know you need to leave. Now." Grace watched through the window as Ben grabbed Tom's arm, pulling him away from the door. Tom tried to resist, but Ben's grip was firm. Years of mechanical work had kept him strong, and Tom's drunken state made him unsteady on his feet. "This isn't over," Tom snarled as Ben marched him toward the street. "You hear me, Grace? This isn't over." Grace's hands trembled as she unlocked the door. Ben stood on her porch, watching until Tom's uneven footsteps faded into the night. When he turned to face her, his eyes were filled with concern. "You shouldn't stay here alone," he said quietly. "Not with him in this state." Grace wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself. "I'll be fine. He'll calm down eventually." Ben shook his head. "He's drunk and angry. That's a dangerous combination." He hesitated for a moment. "I have a spare room." "You could stay there until things settle down." Grace's first instinct was to refuse. She'd spent years building walls around herself, learning to be independent. But Tom's threats still echoed in her ears, and the thought of spending the night alone, in her house, made her stomach churn. "I don't want to impose," she said softly. "It's not an imposition," Ben assured her. "Just until we figure out how to handle this situation. My daughter's room is empty while she's at college." Grace looked back at her house, then at Ben's steady, reassuring presence. The decision wasn't easy, but the alternative seemed worse. "Let me get a few things," she said finally. Ben nodded, relief visible on his face. "Take your time. I'll wait right here." Grace stepped into Ben's home, clutching her small overnight bag close. The house was modest but welcoming, with warm oak floors and comfortable furniture that spoke of years of use. Family photos lined the walls, many showing Ben with a younger Sophia, their smiles bright and genuine. "Kitchen's this way," Ben said, leading her through the living room. "I was just about to make dinner when you called. Nothing fancy, but you're welcome to join me." The kitchen was neat and organized, with well-worn cookware hanging from hooks and a collection of magnets decorating the refrigerator. A pot of water was already beginning to boil on the stove. "Can I help?" Grace asked, setting her bag down by the kitchen counter. She needed something to do with her hands, something to keep her mind off the events of the evening. Ben smiled, the expression softening his weathered features. "Sure. There's some vegetables in the fridge that need chopping. I thought we'd have spaghetti, if that's okay." "Perfect," Grace said, retrieving the vegetables. She found a cutting board and knife, falling into an easy rhythm as she sliced bell peppers and onions. The kitchen filled with the comfortable sounds of cooking, the bubble of boiling water, the sizzle of vegetables hitting the pan, the gentle tap of knife against cutting board. Ben moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, stirring sauce and checking pasta without any wasted motion. "You seem very comfortable in the kitchen," Grace observed, watching him add seasonings to the sauce without measuring. Ben shrugged, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Had to learn after Sophia was born. Couldn't have her living on takeout and TV dinners." He stirred the sauce thoughtfully. "Besides, cooking's not so different from working on engines. Follow the steps, pay attention to the details, and usually things turn out right." Grace found herself chuckling at the comparison. "I've never thought of it that way." They worked together in comfortable silence, moving around each other in the kitchen as if they'd done this dozens of times before. Grace noticed how Ben seemed completely at ease. His movements relaxed despite the tension of their earlier confrontation with Tom. When the meal was ready, Ben set 2 plates on the small kitchen table. The overhead light cast a warm glow over the simple dinner, making it feel cozy rather than cramped. "This is wonderful," Grace said after her first bite. The sauce was rich with herbs and garlic. The pasta cooked perfectly. "Old family recipe," Ben replied, his voice warm. "My mother taught me before I enlisted. Said every soldier should know how to cook at least one decent meal." Grace watched as he twisted pasta around his fork, struck by how different he was from Tom. Where Tom had been loud and demanding, Ben was quiet and steady. Where Tom had tried to control every situation, Ben seemed content to let things unfold naturally. "Thank you," she said suddenly. "Not just for dinner, but for everything. For helping with Tom, for offering me a place to stay." "You didn't have to do any of it." Ben looked up from his plate, his eyes serious. "Yes, I did. No one should have to face that kind of situation alone." He paused, considering his words. "I've seen enough darkness in the world to know how important it is to help when you can." They finished their meal, talking about lighter things. Sophia's college experiences, Grace's letter writing, Ben's work at the garage. It felt normal, almost domestic, and Grace found herself relaxing despite the circumstances that had brought her here. After dinner, Ben showed her to the guest room, Sophia's room. It was neat but lived in, with college pennants on the walls and family photos on the dresser. A handmade quilt covered the bed, its patterns complex and beautiful. "Bathrooms across the hall," Ben said, standing in the doorway. "I'm down at the end if you need anything. Don't hesitate to wake me." Grace nodded, setting her bag on a chair. "Thank you, Ben." "Really?" He gave her a gentle smile. "Get some rest. We'll figure things out in the morning." After Ben left, Grace got ready for bed, going through her evening routine in the unfamiliar bathroom. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant hum of the heating system. Back in the guest room, she slipped under the quilt, its weight comforting despite its unfamiliarity. The bed was comfortable, the room peaceful, but sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept circling back to Tom's threats, to Ben's quiet strength, to the strange turn her life had taken. Grace rolled onto her side, staring at the moonlight, filtering through the curtains. She felt safe here, safer than she had in her own home earlier that evening. But with that safety came a peculiar vulnerability. Being here, under Ben's roof, accepting his protection, that tense, it made everything more real, more serious. Guilt crept in around the edges of her thoughts. She shouldn't have involved Ben in her problems. He had his own life, his own concerns, yet he had stepped in without hesitation, offering help as naturally as breathing. The clock on the nightstand showed 11:45. Somewhere in the house, she heard Ben moving around, probably doing one final check of the doors and windows. The sound was oddly comforting, a reminder that she wasn't alone. Grace pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders, feeling the weight of the day settling over her. Relief and guilt continued their dance in her mind, but exhaustion was finally beginning to win out. As she drifted toward sleep, she couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow would bring and how long she could accept Ben's kindness before it became too much to bear. The morning sun filtered through Ben's kitchen window, casting warm patches of light across the wooden table where they sat. Grace wrapped her hands around a steaming mug of coffee, breathing in its comforting aroma. Ben had made them a simple breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast, and the familiar routine of sharing a meal helped ease some of the tension from the previous night. "Thank you again," Grace said softly, "for everything." Ben nodded, his eyes fixed on his coffee cup. The morning quiet stretched between them until he cleared his throat. "I used to have nights like last night," he said, his voice low and measured. "After I came back from overseas, the smallest things would set me off. A car backfiring, fireworks, even thunder sometimes." Grace set her mug down, watching him carefully. His shoulders were tense, hands clasped tightly around his cup as if anchoring himself to the present. "The doctors called it PTSD," he continued, "but putting a name to it didn't make it any easier." He paused, running a hand through his gray-streaked hair. "Sophia was just a little girl then. She'd find me sitting in the dark, just waiting for danger that wasn't there. That must have been so hard," Grace said gently, "especially as a single parent." Ben's eyes met hers, and she saw a flash of pain there. "Harder on her, I think. Kids shouldn't have to tiptoe around their own father." He pushed his plate aside. "But we got through it, day by day." Sometimes hour by hour, Grace felt her heart ache for the younger Ben and his daughter. "Children are more resilient than we think," she said. "My husband." She paused, surprised by her own willingness to share. "After John passed, I worried so much about our kids, but they helped me more than they knew, just by being there, needing me to keep going." Ben leaned back in his chair, his posture softening. "How long ago did you lose him?" 15 years next month." Grace traced the rim of her coffee mug. "Heart attack. It was so sudden. One minute we were planting our garden for spring, and the next." She swallowed hard. The hardest part was learning to be alone again, to make decisions without having someone to bounce ideas off of. "I get that," Ben said. "After Sarah, my wife, left, it took me years to stop turning to tell her something funny Sophia did, or asking her opinion about dinner." He gave a small, sad smile. "The mind plays tricks on you." Grace nodded, understanding completely. "John used to leave little notes for me everywhere, in my coat pockets, between the pages of my books. For months after he died, I kept finding them. Each one felt like a gift and a punch to the gut at the same time." "Is that why you started writing to soldiers?" Ben asked quietly. Grace looked up, surprised. "How did you know about that?" "Small town," he said with a slight shrug. "Plus, I recognized your name from some of the letters the guys in my unit received. They meant a lot to us out there." A warm blush colored Grace's cheeks. "It helped me feel connected to something bigger than my grief. And honestly, it helped me more than it probably helped them. Having someone to write to share my thoughts with. It gave me purpose when I needed it most." Ben's expression softened. "We all need that sometimes. A reason to keep moving forward." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the morning sun growing stronger. Grace felt something shift between them, as if sharing their past hurts had created a bridge of understanding. "After John died," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I thought I'd never feel safe again. Then Tom came along, and for a while, I thought he was my second chance." She rapped, her arms around herself. "I was so wrong about that." Ben's jaw tightened at the mention of Tom, but his voice remained gentle. "You couldn't have known. People like that, they're good at hiding who they really are at first. The worst part was how he made me doubt myself, Grace admitted. Every decision, every thought, every feeling, he'd question it all until I started questioning myself. That's what they do, Ben said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. Break you down piece by piece until you can't trust your own judgment anymore. Grace looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the understanding in his eyes. This man who had faced his own battles, who still carried his own scars, somehow made her feel safer than she had in years. Sometimes I wonder, she said, if I'll ever stop being afraid. Ben reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. The fear doesn't go away completely, he said, but it gets smaller, more manageable, and eventually, you learn to trust yourself again. Grace felt tears prick at her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. Something else was building in her chest, something that felt like hope. I think I need some fresh air, she said, standing up. Would you mind if I took a walk around your yard? Of course not, Ben replied. Take all the time you need. Grace stepped out onto Ben's front porch, breathing in the crisp morning air. The sky was a brilliant blue, and birds were singing in the old maple tree that shaded the yard. She walked slowly down the steps, each step feeling lighter than the last. For the first time in years, she felt sane, truly sane, not as a victim or a burden, but as someone who had survived, someone who understood. The weight of her fears was still there, but it felt different somehow, as if sharing it with Ben had made it more bearable. A gentle breeze rustled through the leaves, and Grace closed her eyes, letting the morning sun warm her face. The world suddenly seemed fuller, richer with possibility. A small spark of hope flickered in her heart, tentative and fragile, but undeniably there. Ben's truck rumbled down the quiet residential street toward Grace's house. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw set in a firm line. Grace could feel the tension radiating from him, even though he tried to hide it behind his usual calm demeanor. You don't have to do this, Ben said softly, breaking the silence. You can stay at my place longer. We can send someone else to get your things. Grace shook her head, her silver hair catching the morning light. I need to do this myself, Ben. I can't let him control my life like this. Her voice was steady, but her hands fidgeted with the hem of her cardigan. Ben pulled up in front of her modest white house, with its neat flower beds and wind chimes tinkling in the breeze. Everything looked exactly as she'd left it, peaceful and ordinary. But somehow, it felt different now. At least let me come in with you, Ben said, already opening his door. It wasn't really a question. Grace nodded, grateful for his presence, even though she wished she didn't need it. They walked up the stone path to her front door together, Ben's footsteps heavy and purposeful beside her lighter ones. Inside, Grace moved quickly through her familiar rooms, gathering clothes and essentials into a small suitcase. Ben stood near the windows, his military training evident in the way he scanned the street outside. She could see the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his hand occasionally brushed against his hip where a weapon might have once been. I just need to get some things from my bedroom, Grace said, heading down the hallway. The afternoon light streamed through her lace curtains, making patterns on her quilted bedspread. She pulled open drawers, selecting comfortable clothes and necessary items. Grace. Ben's voice carried from the prazzed living room, low and urgent. Come here. She hurried back, her heart jumping at his tone. Ben stood at the front window, his broad shoulders tense. He's across the street. Grace moved to the window, and her breath caught in her throat. Tom stood under a maple tree, trying to look casual but clearly watching the house. He wore the same smug expression she remembered from their marriage, the one that always preceded his worst moments. I shouldn't have brought you here, Ben muttered, more to himself than to her. His protective instinct was visible in every line of his body. You didn't bring me here. I chose to come, Grace reminded him, though her voice shook slightly. She forced herself to turn away from the window and continue packing. I won't let him see me afraid. Ben moved away from the window, but positioned himself where he could still keep an eye on the street. You're one of the bravest people I've ever met, you know that? The simple statement, delivered in his matter-of-fact way, brought unexpected tears to Grace's eyes. She busied herself with gathering her medication from the bathroom cabinet, trying to hide her emotion. "I'm not brave," she said finally, zipping up her toiletry bag. "I'm just tired of being afraid." "That's what bravery is," Ben replied quietly. "Doing what needs to be done, even when you're scared." Grace paused in her packing, struck by his words. She looked at Ben, really looked at him. The way he stood guard in her living room, strong and steady, but with gentle eyes that held their own pain. Something warm unfurled in her chest, a feeling she'd almost forgotten existed. "He's moving," Ben said suddenly, his voice tight. "Getting closer to the house." Grace's hands trembled as she quickly finished packing. Ben moved to help her, gathering the last few items she pointed out. His movements were efficient and careful, but she could see the growing concern in his eyes. "Time to go," he said firmly, taking her suitcase in one hand and placing his other hand gently on her lower back. The touch was protective rather than possessive, and Grace found herself leaning slightly into his steady presence. They stepped out onto the porch, and Grace could see Tom now, barely 50 feet away. He had that familiar predatory look in his eyes, the one that used to freeze her in place with fear. But this time, with Ben beside her, she managed to keep walking. "You can't hide forever, Grace," Tom called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "You know you'll come back to me eventually. You always do." Ben's hand tightened slightly on her back, but he didn't say anything. He simply guided her to the truck, opened her door, and helped her in. His actions were deliberate and calm, but Grace could see the muscle working in his jaw. As they drove away, Grace watched her house disappear in the side mirror. Tom stood in the street, watching them go, and she felt a familiar wave of fear wash over her. But this time, it was different. This time, she wasn't alone. The drive back to Ben's house was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence. Grace found herself studying his profile as he drove. The determined set of his mouth, the slight gray at his temples, the way his eyes constantly checked the mirrors to ensure they weren't being followed. When they pulled into his driveway, Ben turned off the engine but didn't move to get out. "I'm not letting you out of my sight until we know you're safe," he said quietly. "I hope you understand that." Grace felt overwhelmed by his protectiveness, by the genuine concern in his voice. It was so different from Tom's controlling behavior. Ben wasn't trying to possess her or control her. He simply wanted to keep her safe, and he was willing to put himself between her and danger to do it. Looking at him now, Grace realized how much he'd come to mean to her in such a short time. His quiet strength, his gentle understanding, the way he respected her independence while still offering his support, it all combined to create feelings she hadn't experienced in years. "I understand," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Ben, for everything." The evening settled softly around Ben's house as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the living room windows. Grace sat on one end of the worn leather couch, a quilted throw blanket draped over her legs. Ben settled into his usual spot on the other end, remote control in hand. "I hope you don't mind old movies," Ben said, his voice gentle in the quiet room. "This one's about World War II. Nothing too intense, I promise." Grace smiled, feeling more at ease than she had in days. "I love old movies. They remind me of simpler times." The black and white film flickered to life on the screen. The familiar crackle of vintage audio filled the room, and Grace found herself relaxing deeper into the cushions. She watched Ben from the corner of her eye as he leaned back, his shoulders gradually losing their usual tension. "My father used to watch these," Grace said softly. "He served in Korea. Never talked much about it, though." Ben nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Most of us don't. Some things are better left in the past." On screen, soldiers marched through a European village, and Grace noticed how Ben's expression softened when a young boy offered one of the soldiers a piece of bread. "It wasn't all bad, was it?" she asked. "No," Ben replied, a small smile touching his lips. "There were moments of kindness, even in the darkest times. Like your letters to the soldiers. They make a difference, Grace. More than you know." Heat crept into her cheeks at his words. It's just my small way of helping. They fell into a comfortable silence, both absorbed in the story unfolding before them. When a humorous scene played out, involving a soldier trying to communicate with a French farmer about borrowing his bicycle, they both chuckled. The sound of their shared laughter seemed to fill the room with warmth. "Would you like some tea?" Ben asked, during a quiet moment in the film. "That would be lovely," Grace replied. Ben returned from the kitchen with 2 steaming mugs, handling them with careful precision. Grace noticed how his large hands, usually so suited to working with tools and engines, held the delicate cups with surprising gentleness. "Chamomile," he said, passing her a mug. "Sophia swears by it, says it helps her sleep during finals week." Grace wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, inhaling the soothing aroma. "You must miss her terribly." "Every day," Ben admitted, settling back into his seat. "But she's where she needs to be, growing into her own person. That's what matters," the movie continued. But Grace found herself paying more attention to the man beside her. In the soft glow of the television screen, she could see the way his expression changed with each scene. The slight furrow of his brow during tense moments, the barely perceptible smile during lighter ones. When a particularly moving scene played out, a soldier reading a letter from home, Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. Without a word, Ben reached over to the side table and handed her a tissue. "Thank you," she whispered, dabbing at her eyes. "Not just for the tissue, but for everything. For being here. For helping me feel safe." Ben's eyes met hers, full of understanding. "Everyone deserves to feel safe, Grace." As the movie progressed, Grace noticed she'd gradually shifted closer to the middle of the couch. Ben remained in his spot, a steady, reassuring presence. The space between them felt comfortable now, not charged with anxiety as it had been just days ago. They shared occasional comments about the film, their voices soft in the darkened room. When a character made a particularly bold decision, Grace shook her head. "I could never be that brave." "You already are," Ben said quietly. "Standing up to Tom, that takes courage." Grace's hands tightened around her empty mug. "It doesn't feel like courage. Most of the time, I'm just scared." "Being scared doesn't make you any less brave," Ben replied. "Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit we need help." His words settled over her like a warm blanket. Grace felt something shift inside her, as if a tightly wound spring was finally beginning to uncoil. For so long, she'd convinced herself that independence meant facing everything alone. But here, in this moment, she began to see things differently. The movie drew to a close, its ending both bittersweet and hopeful. As the credits rolled, neither made a move to turn on the lights right away. The darkness felt safe, making it easier to speak from the heart. "Ben?" Grace's voice was barely above a whisper. "I've spent so many years building walls around myself, thinking that was the only way to stay strong." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But being here, watching this simple movie with you, it's made me realize something." Ben turned slightly toward her, giving her his full attention. "Maybe," she continued, "maybe I don't have to face everything alone. Maybe it's okay to let someone else in sometimes." The silence that followed wasn't heavy or awkward. Instead, it felt like a gentle acknowledgement of something important, something true. Ben's quiet presence beside her offered strength without demands, support without pressure. "Thank you," she said again, her voice stronger now, "for showing me that there are still good people in the world, for helping me remember what it feels like to trust again." We all need someone to remind us of that sometimes. The credits finished rolling, leaving them in the soft darkness of the living room. Grace felt lighter somehow, as if sharing this quiet evening had helped lift some of the weight she'd been carrying for so long. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to rush back behind her protective walls. Here, in this moment, she felt safe enough to just be. The moonlight cast long shadows across Grace's front yard as her car pulled up to the curb. Ben had insisted on taking her to dinner, a simple meal at the local diner to help take her mind off everything. As they approached her house, Grace's breath caught in her throat. The front door hung askew on its hinges. "Stay in the car," Ben ordered, his voice tight with concern. He was already moving, his military training evident in every precise step. "Ben, wait!" Grace called out. But he was already at the door, carefully pushing it open. After a moment that felt like hours, Ben's voice carried from inside. "Grace, call the police." Her hands trembled as she dialed 911. When she finally entered her home, the devastation stopped her cold. Picture frames lay shattered on the floor, their precious memories exposed among broken glass. Her furniture had been overturned, cushions slashed open. The walls bore deep gouges where something sharp had been dragged across them. "Oh, God," Grace whispered, her knees weakening. Ben was at her side instantly, his strong arm supporting her. The kitchen was even worse. Every cabinet stood open, dishes smashed on the counters and floor. But what brought tears to Grace's eyes was her writing desk, the special place where she wrote her letters to soldiers. Papers were strewn everywhere, many torn to pieces. Her collection of responses from soldiers over the years lay scattered and damaged. "My letters," she choked out, dropping to her knees to gather the torn pieces. "All those years of correspondence." Ben knelt beside her, his jaw clenched tight. "We need to document everything for the police. Don't touch anything else." Grace wrapped her arms around herself, shaking. "This is all my fault. I should have known he'd do something like this." "None of this is your fault," Ben said firmly. His hand rested on her shoulder, warm and steady. "This is all Tom. He's showing his true colors now." Red and blue lights flickered through the windows as police cars pulled up outside. 2 officers entered, their faces grim as they surveyed the damage. They took photos and notes, asked questions about Tom, and collected evidence where they could find it. "You should file for a restraining order," one officer suggested, flipping through his notepad. This level of vandalism, combined with his previous threatening behavior, would make a strong case. Grace shook her head. "No, please. Filing charges will only make him angrier. I just want him to leave me alone." Ben stepped forward, his expression determined. "Grace, we need to report this. He's escalating. Next time?" "Next time?" Grace's voice cracked. I can't think about a next time." After the police left, Ben insisted on checking every room, making sure Tom wasn't still hiding somewhere. Grace followed him numbly, cataloging the destruction. Her bedroom had been ransacked, drawers emptied onto the floor, her clothes torn and scattered. Even her mattress had been slashed open. "You can't stay here tonight," Ben said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We'll come back tomorrow and start cleaning up. But right now, we need to get you somewhere safe." Grace stood in the middle of her violated home, surrounded by the wreckage of her life. "I thought I was done being afraid of him," she whispered. "I thought I was stronger now." Ben turned to her, his eyes intense. "You are strong, stronger than you know. But being strong doesn't mean facing this alone." "I've put you in the middle of this mess," Grace said, wiping at her eyes. "It's not fair to you." "Life isn't fair," Ben replied, his voice gentle. "But we get to choose how we handle the unfair parts. And I'm choosing to stand with you." They gathered what Grace would need for the night, clothing that hadn't been damaged, toiletries, and the few intact photos she could find. As they walked to Ben's truck, Grace looked back at her house, a home she'd made for herself after years of struggle. Now it felt tainted, marked by Tom's rage and hatred. The drive to Ben's house was quiet, both lost in their thoughts. When they arrived, Ben made her tea while she sat at his kitchen table, still processing the night's events. "I'll sleep on the couch," Ben said, setting the steaming mug in front of her. "You take my room. It's more comfortable than the guest room." Grace wrapped her hands around the warm mug. "I can't take your bed, Ben. You've done too much already." "Grace." He sat down across from her, his eyes meeting hers. "You need real rest tonight. Please let me do this for you." She nodded, too exhausted to argue further. The tea was sweet and hot, and it helped calm her nerves slightly. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the destruction of her home, felt the violation of her safe space. That night, lying in Ben's bed, surrounded by his clean masculine scent, Grace finally let herself cry. She cried for the young woman she'd been, who'd thought Tom's possessiveness meant love. She cried for the years she'd spent walking on eggshells, trying to avoid his anger. And she cried for her present self, who'd thought she was finally free of his shadow. Morning came too soon, sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows. Grace found Ben in the kitchen, making coffee. He looked like he hadn't slept much either. "I've been thinking," he said, handing her a cup. "Tom's not going to stop on his own. What he did last night, that's not just anger. That's dangerous obsession." Grace stared into her coffee, seeing the truth in his words. The systematic destruction of her home wasn't just about damaging property. It was about showing her that nowhere was safe from him. "I know," she said quietly. I think I've been fooling myself, hoping he'd just go away if I ignored him. But that's not who he is. It's never been who he is." Ben leaned against the counter, his presence solid and reassuring. "I want you to know something. As long as you need it, you have a safe place here. And I'm not backing down from this fight." Grace looked up at him, seeing the determination in his face. There was something else there, too. Something that made her heart beat a little faster despite everything. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Not just of Tom, but of accepting help, of depending on someone else." "I know," Ben said softly. "But you're not alone anymore, Grace. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." The autumn breeze rustled through Miller Park as Grace sat beside Ben watching children play. Their laughter reminded her of simpler times. "Sometimes I forget what normal feels like," Grace said softly, following a mother pushing her daughter on swings. After Tom left, then, when John passed, she twisted her gold wedding band. Ben shifted beside her. After deployment, everything felt wrong. Like watching life through a window instead of living it. "Does it ever get easier?" "Some days are better," Ben admitted, picking up a red maple leaf. "Sophia helped give me purpose. But trusting people, again, that's been hardest." Grace watched teenagers pass, full of hope. "I used to write letters to soldiers, thinking I was helping them find hope. Really, I was trying to find it myself. Now I'm afraid to hope it feels like tempting fate." Ben studied the leaf's veins. "My commanding officer said, 'Hope isn't weakness, soldier. It's ammunition.' Took years to understand. He meant hoping for something better keeps us fighting. Without hope, we've already lost." A dog chased a tennis ball past them. Grace chuckled, and Ben joined in. "John and I came here every Sunday after church," Grace said. "I haven't done that in years." "Maybe it's time for new memories," Ben suggested, offering his hand. "Walk around the lake?" Grace hesitated, then took his hand. They walked slowly among fall colors, shoulders occasionally brushing. "Sophia called last night," Ben said. "She's doing well, wants to come home for Thanksgiving. That must make you happy." "It does. Though I worry I've been too protective after her mother left. You were keeping her safe. Any parent would understand." At the observation deck, ducks glided past, creating ripples. "What do you hope for?" Ben asked. Grace gripped the railing. "Peace. To not jump at every shadow. To feel like myself again." "You're stronger than you think," Ben said with certainty. "I've seen it. Sometimes strength isn't enough." "No, but you're not alone anymore." They passed other couples. Joggers. Dog walkers' normality, both foreign and comforting. "I used to think being alone was safer," Grace admitted. "I told myself the same thing after losing friends overseas. Seemed easier keeping everyone at arm's length." He kicked a stone. "But that's not really living. Starting over is terrifying. Everything worth doing usually is." The late afternoon sun painted everything golden. Grace felt lighter. "Thank you," she said suddenly. "For what?" "For reminding me, hope isn't foolish." Their hands brushed as they walked, and neither pulled away. The simple contact sent warmth through Grace's chest. For the first time in years, she imagined a future not defined by fear. Grace found herself walking slower, wanting to hold on to this moment. In their touching fingers, she felt something she thought lost forever hope. Fragile, but persistent. Like spring's first bloom after winter. The moon cast shadows across Grace's room. She lay awake, listening to the bedside clock. Sleep elusive, with worries crowding her mind. A noise outside made her sit up. Through the window, she saw a dark figure stumbling near the flower beds. Her heart stopped Tom's silhouette in the moonlight. Grace. His voice carried through the night. Slurred and angry. Get out here! She froze, trembling as Tom swayed drunkenly and kicked over Ben's ceramic planter. The crash echoed through the quiet neighborhood. I know you're in there. You can't hide forever. Grace slipped from bed, bare feet silent on hardwood. She needed her phone from the kitchen. Tom's voice grew louder. You belong with me! Another crash, the birdbath toppled. Grace crept toward her door, heart pounding. Behind her, Ben's bedroom door opened. Grace? He called softly. Tom started pounding the front door. The house shook with each blow. Open this door now! Get back, Ben whispered, moving past her. But Grace couldn't leave him alone. I'm calling police, she whispered. The door shuddered as Tom continued his assault. You think you can replace me with this broken soldier? Ben tensed but remained focused, positioning himself between Grace and the door. Call them. I'll handle Tom. Grace grabbed her phone, hands shaking. Tom's voice became unhinged. You're nothing without me. Ben moved to the door. Tom, you need to leave. Now. Or what? You gonna fight me, soldier boy? A massive crash. Tom had thrown something through the living room window. Glass scattered as night air rushed in. That's it! Tom growled, climbing through. Face me like a man. Last warning, Tom. Back off. But Tom lunged through the broken window, alcohol rolling off him in waves. You think you can protect her? Tom sneered. She's mine. Grace backed away, clutching her phone. Ben stood firm. She doesn't belong to anyone. Tom laughed uglily. I'm taking back what's mine. He lunged forward, but Ben blocked his path. Tom stumbled, catching himself on the wall. Don't make this worse, Ben warned. Tom reached into his jacket. Grace's blood ran cold, seeing metal glint. Ben stepped forward, grabbed Tom's wrist, and twisted. The knife clattered down as Tom howled. You broke my wrist! Your wrist isn't broken, Ben said calmly, kicking the knife away. But you're done. Police sirens wailed closer. Tom's eyes darted wildly. This isn't over, he snarled at Grace. Officers burst through the brand. Door, weapons drawn. Hands up! As they handcuffed Tom, he kept staring at Grace. You'll regret this. They led Tom away, his threats fading. Grace stood trembling as Ben turned to her with concern. Are you all right? She nodded, watching the police cars' flashing lights disappear into darkness. The red and blue lights of police cars painted dancing shadows on the walls of Ben's living room. Grace sat on the couch, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea that Ben had insisted she drink. Her fingers trembled slightly, causing ripples in the amber liquid. Ma'am, could you please walk us through what happened tonight? The female officer's voice was gentle but professional as she held her notepad ready. Grace took a deep breath, feeling Ben's steady presence beside her on the couch. I was in bed when I heard him shouting from the yard. Tom, my ex-husband. He was drunk and demanding I come outside. The officer nodded, writing carefully. And what happened next? I froze at first, Grace admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But then he started throwing things at my window. That's when Ben heard the commotion. Ben shifted slightly beside her, his quiet strength helping her continue. Tom had picked up one of the garden rocks. He was threatening to break in if I didn't come out to talk to him. The second officer, standing near the fireplace, turned toward Ben. And that's when you intervened, sir? Yes. Ben's voice was steady but tight with controlled anger. I heard the commotion and found him in the yard. He was clearly intoxicated and becoming increasingly aggressive. Grace watched as Ben described the confrontation, how Tom had lunged at him, how Ben had managed to subdue him without throwing a single punch, holding him down until the police arrived. The pride she felt in Ben's restraint brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "You did everything right," the female officer assured them both. "We have Mr. Thompson in custody, and given his previous record and tonight's events, he'll be facing serious charges." Grace nodded, relief washing over her in waves. She felt Ben's hand rest gently on her shoulder, and she leaned into his touch, drawing comfort from his presence. After the officers left, the house felt eerily quiet. Grace sat still on the couch, her tea now cold and forgotten. Ben hadn't moved from her side, patient and protective as always. "You're safe now," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "He can't hurt you anymore." Grace turned to look at him. Really look at him. His face showed concern, but there was something else there too, a tenderness that made her heart skip a beat. "Thank you, Ben, for everything. Let me fix you some fresh tea," he said, taking her cold mug. In the kitchen, she could hear him moving around, the familiar sounds of water boiling and cups clinking, providing a comforting normalcy to the night's chaos. When he returned, he sat closer to her than before. "You should try to get some rest," he suggested gently. Grace shook her head. "I don't think I could sleep right now. Everything feels surreal." Ben nodded in understanding. "Then we'll stay up together. Would you like to talk about it?" "Actually," Grace said, surprising herself, "I'd rather talk about anything else." A small smile touched Ben's lips. "Well, in that case, why don't we get out of here for a while? Get some late dinner?" Grace glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. "At this hour? I know a place," Ben said, standing and offering her his hand. "Sometimes, after a rough night, you need something normal to remind you that life goes on." 20 minutes later, they were sitting in a small 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town. The fluorescent lights cast a warm glow over the worn red vinyl booths, and the smell of coffee and grilled onions filled the air. It was nearly empty, except for a tired-looking trucker at the counter and a young couple in the corner booth. Grace ordered a grilled cheese sandwich and a chocolate shake, while Ben got coffee and apple pie. The familiar comfort food and the diner's peaceful atmosphere began to work their magic, helping her shoulders relax for the first time since Tom's appearance. "I used to come here a lot," Ben said, stirring his coffee. "After coming home from deployment, something about this place, it helped ground me when everything else felt chaotic." Grace watched him, noticing how the diner's light softened his features. Did it help, coming here? It did, still does. He met her eyes. Sometimes you need a reminder that there's still good in the world. Simple things, like hot coffee and apple pie at midnight. Grace felt warmth spread through her chest. That had nothing to do with her hot sandwich. She studied Ben's face, seeing beyond the strong, protective exterior to the gentle soul beneath. Here was a man who understood pain and healing, who knew when to fight and when to simply sit in comfortable silence over comfort food. "You know what?" she said, taking a sip of her shake. "You're right. This is exactly what I needed." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the quiet broken only by the soft clink of silverware and the distant sound of cars passing on the highway. Grace found herself watching Ben's hands as he carefully cut his pie into small, neat bites. Those same hands that had protected her earlier now handled his fork with surprising gentleness. "Ben?" she said softly. He looked up, his eyes questioning. "Thank you for knowing exactly what I needed tonight. For being here. For this." She gestured at the diner around them. "For everything." Ben's expression softened. "You don't need to thank me, Grace. I'm just glad you're safe." In that moment, sitting across from him in the quiet diner, Grace felt something shift inside her. The fear and anxiety from earlier began to fade, replaced by a growing warmth and certainty. Ben's presence in her life had become more than just protection. It had become a comfort, a source of strength, and something else she wasn't quite ready to name yet. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand briefly. His fingers curled around hers, warm and reassuring. Before letting go, they didn't need words to understand what had passed between them. Sometimes, Grace realized, the most important things were said in silence, over grilled cheese sandwiches and apple pie at midnight. The morning sun streamed through Ben's kitchen windows, casting warm patches of light across the wooden table where Grace sat, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. The events of last night felt like a distant nightmare, but the reality of Tom's arrest had finally settled in. She was free. Ben stood at the counter, fixing himself a second cup of coffee. His movements were careful, deliberate, as if he was trying not to startle her. "How are you feeling?" he asked softly. Grace managed a small smile. "Better. Lighter. Somehow." She paused, watching him take the seat across from her. "Thank you, Ben, for everything." His eyes met hers, filled with warmth and understanding. "You don't need to thank me, Grace." "But I do," she insisted, her voice growing stronger. "You've been here for me when you didn't have to be. You opened your home to me, protected me." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "You made me feel safe again." Ben's hand moved across the table, settling near hers but not quite touching. "I couldn't stand by and watch him hurt you." Grace felt tears welling up in her eyes. "I've been so afraid for so long, not just of Tom, but of everything. Of letting anyone close again." Her fingers inched toward his. "But you changed that. Grace." Ben's voice was rough, with emotion. "I know it's complicated," she continued, her heart pounding. "We both have our scars, our fears. But being here with you, getting to know you." She met his gaze directly. "I've developed feelings for you, Ben, and that terrifies me almost as much as it makes me happy." Ben's hand finally covered hers, his touch gentle but sure. "I understand fear, Grace. After coming back from war, after losing my wife, I thought I'd never." He cleared his throat. "I thought I'd never feel this way about anyone again." Grace's breath caught in her throat. "This way? You snuck up on me," he admitted with a small smile. "With your quiet strength, your kindness, the way you write those letters to soldiers, giving them hope when you were struggling yourself." His thumb traced small circles on her hand. "I tried to keep my distance, to just be there as a friend, but—" "But?" Grace whispered, hardly daring to breathe. "But I fell for you anyway." The words came out quietly, but with unmistakable certainty. Grace felt tears spill onto her cheeks. "I'm not sure I know how to do this anymore," she confessed. "Being with someone, trusting someone. What if I mess it up?" Ben's other hand came up to gently wipe away her tears. "We take it one day at a time. No pressure, no rush. We've both lived enough to know that nothing's guaranteed, but—" He squeezed her hand. "I think what we have is worth the risk." Grace nodded slowly, a warmth spreading through her chest. "It is. You are." She took a shaky breath. "I spent so many years running from love, convinced it would only hurt me again. But being with you, it feels different. Safe." Ben stood up, still holding her hand, and guided her to her feet. They stood close, the morning sunlight wrapping around them like a warm embrace. His eyes searched hers, full of tenderness and understanding. "May I?" he asked softly, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. Grace's heart fluttered as she nodded. Ben leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. But she didn't want to. Instead, she tilted her face up to meet his. When their lips met, it was gentle, almost reverent. Ben's kiss was as tender as his touch, carrying all the care and protection he'd shown her these past weeks. Grace felt tears spring to her eyes again, but this time from joy. His arms wrapped around her waist, holding her close but not too tight, always mindful of her need to feel free. The kiss was brief but full of promise. When they pulled apart, Grace stayed in the circle of his arms, overwhelmed by the tenderness of the moment. She rested her head against his chest, listening to his steady heartbeat, and for the first time in years, she felt completely, utterly at peace. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Ben's front porch as Grace sat in the old wooden rocking chair, trying to find peace in its gentle motion. The past few days had been relatively quiet since Tom's arrest, but something didn't feel right. Her mother's intuition was screaming at her. Her phone buzzed. Grace's heart stopped when she saw her daughter's name on the screen. With trembling fingers, she answered, "Sarah? Is everything okay?" "Mom," her daughter's voice shook. "I just got a really scary message from Tom. He said he knows where I live, and that if you don't talk to him, he'll. Sarah's voice cracked. Grace's world tilted sideways. The rocking chair creaked to a halt as her body went rigid. "What exactly did he say, sweetheart?" Inside the house, Ben was working on some paperwork at his kitchen table. Through the window, he noticed Grace's sudden stillness and the way her shoulders tensed. Something was wrong. "He said he'd make me regret taking your side," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, I'm scared. I know he's out on bail, but I didn't think he'd." "Listen to me carefully," Grace interrupted, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Are you at home right now?" "Yes, I'm in my apartment. Lock all your doors and windows. Don't open them for anyone." Grace was already on her feet, heading inside. Ben met her at the door, concern etched on his face. "I'm going to call the police, and then Ben and I are coming over." Ben's expression hardened as Grace quickly explained the situation. Without hesitation, he grabbed his truck keys. "I'll drive," he said firmly. "You call the police." They were in Ben's truck within minutes, the engine roaring to life. Grace's hand shook as she dialed 911, reporting Tom's threat and violation of the restraining order. Ben's jaw was set in a hard line as he navigated the streets, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I should have known he wouldn't stop," Grace said, her voice thick with guilt. "I should have seen this coming. This isn't your fault." Ben's voice was gentle but firm. "Tom's the one choosing to do this. We're going to keep Sarah safe." As they drove, Grace stayed on the phone with Sarah, making sure she remained calm and secure in her apartment. Ben's presence beside her was like an anchor, steady and strong. They arrived at Sarah's apartment complex in record time, finding 2 police cars already parked outside. Ben scanned the parking lot as they got out of the truck, his military training evident in his alert posture and watchful eyes. They hurried up to Sarah's 3rd-floor apartment, where 2 officers were already speaking with her. Sarah flew into her mother's arms the moment they entered. "Mom!" she cried, trembling. Grace held her daughter tight, feeling both fierce protection and terrible fear. "We've documented the threatening messages," one of the officers explained, "and we're putting out an APB for Mr. Thomas Richards. This is a clear violation of his bail conditions and the restraining order." Ben positioned himself near the window, keeping watch while maintaining a protective stance. "What security measures can we take right now?" he asked the officers. As they discussed immediate safety protocols, Grace's phone suddenly lit up with an unknown number. The room fell silent. With shaking hands, she showed it to the officers, who nodded for her to answer and put it on speaker. "Hello?" Grace's voice was steady, stronger than she felt. "You think you can keep her from me?" Tom's voice was slurred, angry. "I made you who you are, Grace. You and that brat of yours owe me." "This is Officer Martinez," one of the police officers cut in. "Mr. Richards, you are in violation of your bail conditions and the standing restraining order. Your location is being traced as we speak." There was a moment of stunned silence. Then Tom began cursing. The call ended abruptly. "We've got a location," the second officer said into his radio. "All units respond." The next hour was tense. Ben stayed with Grace and Sarah, while the officers coordinated with their colleagues. They could hear sirens in the distance, and Grace held her daughter close, praying this would finally be over. The call came 45 minutes later. They had found Tom 3 blocks away, sitting in his car, watching the apartment complex. He had been drinking and had a knife in the passenger seat. The officers had arrested him without incident. Sarah sagged against her mother in relief. Ben's shoulders relaxed slightly, though he maintained his vigilant watch. He'll be held without bail this time, Officer Martinez assured them. The threats, the violation of the restraining order, the weapon. He's looking at serious charges. Grace felt tears sliding down her cheeks. Tears of relief, of leftover fear, of gratitude. Ben moved closer, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. Sarah looked up at him with grateful eyes, understanding now why her mother had come to trust this quiet, strong man. "We'll need statements from both of you," the officer continued, "but that can wait until tomorrow. For tonight, I suggest staying somewhere safe." "You're both coming home with me," Ben said firmly. No room for argument in his voice. "Sophia will be happy to see you, Sarah." "She's been wanting to meet you." Grace nodded, too emotionally exhausted to protest. As they helped Sarah pack an overnight bag, she watched Ben checking the locks one final time, making sure the officers had all the information they needed. His quiet strength had become such a vital part of her life, and now he was protecting not just her, but her daughter too. The sun had fully set by the time they left Sarah's apartment. A police cruiser would remain parked outside overnight, making sure no one tried to enter. As they drove back to Ben's house, Grace felt the iron bands of fear around her chest finally begin to loosen. Tom was in custody. Her daughter was safe. And beside her sat a man who had shown her what real protection, real care looked like. For the first time in years, Grace felt truly free. The morning light filtered through the kitchen windows as Grace stirred honey into her tea, watching the golden swirls dance in the ceramic mug. Ben stood at the counter, making breakfast, something he'd been doing every morning since moving in temporarily after Tom's arrest. The familiar sizzle of bacon and the warm aroma of coffee filled the space between them. "You know," Ben said, flipping a pancake with practiced ease, "I never thought I'd enjoy cooking breakfast for someone again." His voice was soft, carrying a hint of wonder that made Grace's heart flutter. Grace smiled, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "And I never thought I'd enjoy having someone cook for me." She paused, watching his strong hands move confidently around the kitchen. "It's nice, isn't it? Having someone to share mornings with?" Ben turned, his eyes meeting hers with a warmth that made her feel safer than any locked door ever could. "More than nice." He placed a plate of perfectly golden pancakes in front of her. "I've been thinking." Grace raised an eyebrow, taking a small bite. "That sounds serious." "Maybe it is." Ben sat down across from her, his own plate untouched. "I know this arrangement was supposed to be temporary, but—" He ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair, a gesture Grace had come to recognize as a sign of nervousness. "But," she prompted gently, "but I don't want it to be temporary." His words came out in a rush. "I want to be here, Grace. Not just because of Tom, or because we're both scared of being alone. I want to be here because it feels right." Grace felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She reached across the table, taking his weathered hand in hers. "It does feel right, doesn't it?" Ben squeezed her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her skin. "I've spent so many years building walls, trying to protect myself and Sophia. But with you, those walls just disappeared." "I know exactly what you mean," Grace said, thinking about her own carefully constructed defenses. "It's like finally being able to breathe after holding your breath for so long." They finished breakfast talking about practical things, where Ben's tools would fit in the garage, which dresser drawers he could use, how they'd reorganize the closet space. Simple, everyday decisions that felt momentous in their normality. Later that afternoon, they sat on the porch swing, the gentle creaking of chains accompanying their conversation. The spring air was fresh with possibility, carrying the scent of blooming flowers from Grace's garden. "Tell me about your hopes," Ben said, his arm resting comfortably around her shoulders. "What do you want for the future?" Grace leaned into his warmth, considering the question. "I want peace," she said finally. "Not just the absence of fear, but real peace. The kind where you can wake up in the morning and just be happy." She looked up at him. "What about you?" Ben was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. "I want to build something new, something good. All my life, I've been either fighting or recovering from fights. I want to create instead of destroy." He smiled down at her. "And I want to do it with you." They spent the rest of the afternoon moving Ben's things from his house to hers. Each box unpacked felt like another brick in the foundation they were building together. Grace found herself smiling as she made space in her closet for his flannel shirts as she arranged his books alongside hers on the shelves. As the sun began to set, Ben suggested they take a walk. The neighborhood was quiet, the streets bathed in the golden light of early evening. Their hands found each other naturally as they walked, fingers intertwining with familiar ease. "You know what I realized?" Grace said as they passed the park where neighborhood children played. "I'm not waiting for the other shoe to drop anymore. For the first time in years, I'm just here, present." Ben nodded, understanding in his eyes. "It's like putting down a heavy pack you've been carrying for so long you forgot what it felt like to stand straight." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, their footsteps falling into an easy rhythm. The spring breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming dogwoods. Grace felt Ben's thumb brush across her knuckles, a small gesture that spoke volumes about the tenderness between them. "Sophia called earlier," Ben said, breaking the silence. "She's happy about us. Says it's about time her old man found someone who makes him smile." Grace chuckled. "She's a wise young woman." "That she is." Ben stopped walking, turning to face Grace. "I want you to know something. I'm not here because I think you need protecting or because I feel responsible. I'm here because being with you makes everything better, clearer, more real." Grace felt tears welling up again. But these were different from all the tears she'd shed in fear or loneliness. These were tears of joy, of recognition, of finding home in another person's heart. They continued their walk as the sky painted itself in shades of pink and orange. Grace felt the peace she'd talked about earlier settling into her bones. It wasn't just the absence of fear, though that was part of it. It was the presence of something else, something warm and steady and true. The simplicity of walking hand in hand with someone who understood her, who had seen her at her most vulnerable and still chose to stay, filled her with a quiet joy. She didn't need grand gestures or dramatic declarations. This was enough, more than enough. It was everything. As they rounded the corner back toward home, their home now, Grace squeezed Ben's hand gently. She didn't need to say anything. The gesture said it all. Gratitude, contentment, love, the knowledge that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. The autumn breeze carried the sweet scent of kettle corn through the town square as Grace and Ben strolled hand in hand among the bustling crowd at the fall festival. Colorful leaves danced around their feet, and the late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the cheerful scene. Street vendors lined the sidewalks, their booths filled with handmade crafts, local honey, and fresh-baked goods. "Look at those quilts," Grace said, pointing to a display of intricate patterns in rich autumn colors. "They remind me of the ones my grandmother used to make." Ben squeezed her hand gently. "Want to take a closer look?" They made their way to the booth, where an elderly woman sat working on her latest creation. Grace ran her fingers over the soft fabric, admiring the precise stitching. The past few months had taught her to appreciate these simple moments of joy, something she'd nearly forgotten how to do during those dark years alone. "You two make such a lovely couple," the quilter said, smiling warmly at them. Grace felt her cheeks flush with pleasure as Ben's arm slipped around her waist. She'd stopped flinching at his touch weeks ago, learning to trust the gentleness in his strong hands. Those same hands that had protected her now brought her comfort and security. They wandered through the festival, stopping occasionally to sample local treats or admire craftwork. The sound of live music drifted from the gazebo in the center of the square, where a local band played familiar tunes. Couples swayed to the melody, and children danced freely on the grass. "Remember our first real conversation?" Ben asked, as they passed the diner where they'd shared countless meals since then. "You were so nervous about letting me drive you home." Grace nodded, thinking back to those early days. "I was scared of everything back then. Scared of Tom, scared of trusting anyone, scared of hoping for something better. And now?" Ben's voice was soft, patient, Now I'm not afraid anymore. Grace paused near a maple tree, its leaves a brilliant orange against the blue sky. You gave me the strength to face my fears, Ben, to believe in myself again. They stopped at a food truck, and Ben bought them both hot apple cider. The warm cups felt good in their hands as they found a bench near the town fountain. Children tossed pennies into the water, making wishes as their parents watched nearby. Sophia called this morning, Ben mentioned, referring to his daughter. She's coming home next weekend for a visit. Grace smiled, remembering how warmly Ben's daughter had welcomed her into their lives. We should make her favorite lasagna. We? Ben's eyes crinkled at the corners. I seem to remember you saying you were a terrible cook. I'm learning. Grace protested with a laugh. Besides, you're a good teacher. A group of veterans walked past, wearing their service caps proudly. Ben nodded to them in silent acknowledgement, and Grace noticed how much more at ease he was these days. The haunted look that used to cloud his eyes had softened. They were healing together, each day bringing new moments of peace. Want to walk through the art show? Ben gestured toward the row of white tents where local artists displayed their work. As they explored the exhibition, Grace found herself drawn to a painting of a sunrise over mountains. The artist had captured the moment when darkness gives way, to light when shadows retreat before the promise of a new day. It's beautiful, she murmured. Like you, Ben said simply, and Grace felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the cider. They continued through the festival, stopping to chat with neighbors and friends. Grace marveled at how different her life had become. Where once she had hidden away, afraid to engage with the world, now she felt part of the community again. People knew her not as a victim, but as herself, a strong woman who had survived and thrived. The late afternoon light turned golden, casting long shadows across the square. Children ran past with painted faces, clutching balloons and cotton candy. The air was filled with laughter and conversation, the sound of people enjoying life together. I never thought I'd have this again, Grace said softly, watching a young couple push a stroller past them. After my husband died, I thought that part of my life was over. And then when Tom came back, she shuddered slightly at the memory. Ben's arm tightened around her protectively. But you survived. You're stronger than you knew. We both are, Grace replied, looking up at him. His face was so dear to her now, every line and angle familiar and beloved. She saw in his eyes the same peace she felt in her heart, the quiet joy of two people who had found each other when they least expected it. They passed a booth selling flowers, and Ben bought her a small bouquet of autumn wildflowers. The simple gesture brought tears to her eyes, not of sadness but of gratitude. How far she had come from those dark days of fear and isolation. How different life looked now, viewed through the lens of love and security. Music from the gazebo changed to a slow, sweet melody. Ben took her hand, leading her toward the other dancing couples. Grace went willingly, no longer afraid of being seen, of being part of the world. As they swayed together, she rested her head against his chest, feeling his steady heartbeat. All around them, the festival continued, a celebration of community, of life itself. Children laughed, old friends reunited, young lovers held hands. And here she was, part of it all, no longer watching from the shadows but living fully in the light. Looking up at Ben's face, Grace felt overwhelmed by how blessed she was. This man who had started as her protector had become so much more her partner, her best friend, her second chance at love. In his arms she had found not just safety, but joy, not just peace, but purpose. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Festival lights twinkled on, creating a magical atmosphere as day transformed into evening. Grace watched the scene with wonder, remembering how dark her world had seemed just months ago. Now everything was different. She was different. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Ben, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.